So at ESCO I presented data from the MajesTEC-1 with an extended follow-up now of 2 years. And patients enrolled in this study were all heavily pretreated. They were exposed to IMiDs, proteasome inhibitors and CD38 antibodies. In fact, 3/4 of the patients was refractory to all these drug classes, so-called triple class refractory disease. And in this study, in the MajesTEC-1 study, patients were treated with monotherapy Teclistamab with 2 step-up doses and with the recommended phase 2 dose of Teclistamab of 1.5 milligrams per kilogram. In the beginning once weekly, but in the study there was the opportunity to switch patients to every 2 weeks if they had achieved a complete remission for 6 months or longer in phase 2, or a partial response for 4 months or longer in phase 1. And patients could even get once every 4 weeks Teclistamab if they had persistent clinical benefit of the drug. So with extended follow-up, so a median follow-up now of 2 years, we see that the overall response rate remains stable at 63%, but with longer follow-up we see that the proportion of patients with a complete remission increased to 45%, which is very high for such a heavily pretreated group of patients. If you treat this group of patients with a standard of care regimen outside of a clinical trial, we would expect a response rate of only 30% and a complete remission rate of 5% or lower. So this is really much higher than what we typically see in this heavily pretreated patient population. We also see with extended follow-up that the median response duration for the whole group of patients is now 22 months, which was 18 months with a shorter follow-up. And for the patients who achieved a complete remission, the median response duration now is 27 months. The median PFS remains stable at 11 months, but is 27 months for those who achieved a complete remission or better. And what is also important is that the median overall survival for all the patients was 22 months, which is also much better than what you typically see in this patient population. When you treat these patients with standard of care regimens outside of clinical trial, you would expect a median overall survival of only 12 months. So here we see an almost doubling, which is even better for those patients who achieve complete response, because here median overall survival was not yet reached. So this is new efficacy data, and when we look at the safety data, the safety profile remained similar to what has been shown before. We see an increase in infections over time, but the increase in infections is flattening, and this is maybe related to the fact that more and more patients are now being treated every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks, and we think that this might result in a lower infectious rate over time. But also we know now what type of supportive care these patients need to be given to prevent infection. So it's important to give patients that receive Teclistamab PGP prophylaxis with cotrimoxazole. It's important to give these patients herpes simplex and herpes zoster prophylaxis with valacyclovir or equivalent drugs. And I think it's extremely important to also give these patients IVIG supplementation when polyclonal IgG drops below 4 grams per liter. And we'll show at EHA meeting next week in Frankfurt in Europe that IVIG from the beginning, when IgG drops below 4, is really making a difference when it comes to the frequency of severe infections. So I already alluded to the fact that the response, progression-free survival, overall survival, response duration with Teclistamab as a monotherapy is much better than what you would expect in this heavily pretreated patient population. In the locomotion study, we looked at the efficacy and safety of real-world physician's choice of therapy. And there we only see a 30% response rate, a median progression-free survival of 3 months, a median overall survival of 12 months. And this is of course much lower than the 65% response, median PFS of 11 months, median response duration of 22 months, and median overall survival of almost 2 years. So this really speaks to the high efficacy of Teclistamab and also other BCMA targeting bispecifics or bispecifics targeting other antigens on the myeloma cell in this heavily pretreated patient population. So next steps are to even get better results, higher response rates and more durable responses. So we are learning now in clinical studies about combination treatment. So at ESCO there was a very interesting abstract presented by Yael Cohen about the combination of Teclistamab and Teclistamab, very high response rate, PFS of almost 2 years. Also high efficacy in patients with extramedullary disease. So the combination of two bispecifics is something that we have to learn more about. And we also learned from the combination of Teclistamab and daratumumab, which looks very promising. Also here a very favorable response rate, long progression-free survival with a safety profile that's similar to that of the individual agents. So combination therapy is certainly something that we will learn more about in the nearby future. Several phase 3 trials are also ongoing in this respect, and we'll learn more about bispecific antibody plus another drug. Another ongoing development is the fact that bispecifics are moving from end-stage patients to earlier lines of therapy. The MajesTEC-1 study is evaluating Teclistamab and daratumumab in patients with 1 to 3 prior lines of therapy with standard of care therapy as a comparator arm. And we are now also using bispecific antibodies in newly diagnosed patients. For example, in MajesTEC-4, we are evaluating Teclistamab as a novel maintenance approach in patients that had induction, transplant, and then we will randomize these patients against Teclistamab or Teclistamab plus lenalidomide, and the comparator arm will be lenalidomide monotherapy, which is at this moment the only approved maintenance therapy in multiple myeloma. And we expect, of course, that the bispecifics as maintenance will result in a deepening of response, a better progression-free survival, and hopefully also better overall survival signal. There are several other open questions. I already alluded to the fact that we are learning about how to best support our patients in terms of infections. Important to give them PGP and herpes virus prophylaxis and IVIG. But we are also learning more about how to best manage cytokine release syndrome. And one of the studies that is also presented here at ESCO by me, representing the whole group of investigators, is the use of prophylactic tocilizumab to reduce the incidence of cytokine release syndrome. And indeed, with tocilizumab, we show that the frequency of CRS goes down from 70% to approximately 27%. And this is a considerable reduction. And maybe the use of prophylactic tocilizumab will in the future be one approach to also give Teclistamab in an outpatient setting. But this is still something that we have to investigate in more detail in ongoing studies.